Hi, Mike Kennedy here, and I thought I'd do a series of videos on the features of the Konica Hexar. This was a excellent camera that was made, and it's reported to have one of the best lenses that were ever made. It's got a 35mm f2 lens. Some people say it's similar in design to one of the Leica lenses. But the one thing that's odd about the camera is, although it has buttons, there are functions that are hidden behind the buttons that you can access. So what I thought I'd do after this very introductory video is we'd go through some of those features that can be accessed. But first I want to tell you something interesting about this is the first one, and it has a silent mode, which virtually, if you put it in the silent mode, if there's any background noise at all in the room, you can't hear the camera operate at all. And then if you were to pre-focus and fire the shutter, even in an extremely quiet environment, you're probably not going to hear it either from a distance. Maybe the photographer would, but it has this feature of having an extremely quiet shutter. Now, for some reason, that got lost in the later models. There was some trouble about patent infringement or something, but it's in the earlier models. What's nice about this one is this is one of the original ones, and the shoe here for the flash got loose, so I sent it to Konica, and they repaired it, and they threw in free the update chip. So this has all the features that any of the Hexars would have, except that it doesn't have the date back. Some had a date back that you could actually imprint on the photographs, the date. But here's something interesting that I read, and I can't swear that this is true, but it seems reasonable to me, that the original plan for the Hexar was that you would put like a 24 exposure roll of film in it. It would take a picture, skip a frame, take another picture, skip a frame, take another picture, and go out 12 exposures. Then when it got to the 12th exposure, it would actually go back and fill in those spaces so that when you get done taking the picture, you didn't have to rewind the film. The film would already be rewound. It would be done. And this was a way to end hearing the rewind sound. But for some reason that was abandoned when they actually did production models. I don't know why, but that just sounds like a really interesting thing to me. And so first, I guess I want to just mention something about loading and unloading it. Okay, and there's a little button here that has an R on it, and that's for manual rewind. And we also have we have two options for the rewind. We have our opening lever over here to open the camera back. We turn this, but if we press this button, we'll see information come up on this, and when we see the lines, if we open the back, the tongue will still be sticking out of the cartridge. If we let it continue, it will pull that tongue in. So let me see if I can just demonstrate that here. We're going to just going to turn it on to a setting. We're going to hit rewind. We get this two flashing, blinking. There were two lines there that were blinking, and that tells us that the tongue is still out. Okay? And to load the camera was extremely simple. I feel I need to explain, though, for people. You know, it's like there's so many people now that have no film background and maybe wanting to get into this camera because it's such a good camera, is that this operated with DX coding. You can see these contacts in here, okay? These interface with what was called DX coding. At one point, all film that was being made, if it wanted to be sold well, had this pattern on it. Now in this pattern is coded what type of film it is, and how many exposures it is. That information is also coded on the film as well, the type of film in a barcode, but that's after development. So by placing the film in the camera already knows the speed of the film, the length of the film, and all that good information. Now let's just put this in, and it wound. It says ASA 400, and we're at our first exposure. So that's how it's loaded and unloaded. And I guess if you're doing your own developing, you might tend to want to keep that tongue out. But the problem with keeping the tongue out is that you can mistakenly put it back in the camera and use it over again, and then you've got a bunch of double exposures, which you've ruined both 2 rolls of film that way. 2 sets of pictures, I guess. 1 roll of film, 2 sets of pictures. But let's talk first in this video about the more obvious modes. We have a program mode, an aperture mode, and a manual mode. Okay, the program mode, as you'll see in the manual, picks a certain program of shutter speeds and F numbers, and that's influenced by the lighting conditions and the speed of the film. The aperture priority, you would pick the aperture that you most likely wanted to use. Say you were an existing light and you wanted to take a picture of something, and you wanted to have as little of the background or foreground in this focus as you could put it to F2. Now say you're outside and you want dramatic depth of field, you might set it to F16 or smaller. So that was the aperture mode. Then the manual mode is exactly what it says. You pick the shutter speed, the F number here, and with the select button, you can change the shutter speed. And now it's 100th, 180th, 150th, 140th, 130th. Now, this could be very valuable for if you're using a handheld meter, or well, a whole host of other ideas. I guess if you know why you want to be on a manual, you would just know that sometimes you're way smarter than the cameras, especially if you have a light meter. It's complicated lighting. Now this camera does have an option of either doing a spot metering or more of an averaging metering, which we'll discuss later on. Has a self timer, has a manual focus button, a select button, and these are the up and down buttons as well. So that's just the first look at the features that are more intuitive. You've got here the actual electric eye that senses the exposure is fairly close to the lens hood, and this has presented some problems with people adding filters that are too thick. They can they can obscure that. This actually projects an infrared beam, and there's 2 sets of sensors that look at that beam and very accurately determine the distance. Now, I'm not totally clear about this, but I believe it is not actually a rangefinder in the typical sense of the term. That means that it uses an angle of one component to figure out the one of the sides of a triangle, which would be the focus distance. That's how rangefinders normally work. But this has an infrared beam and several sensors in it, and that's how it does the focusing. One of the reasons for the manual focus that is necessary sometimes is the infrared light doesn't go through glass. So if you're by a window and you want to take a picture outside, it's going to focus on the window. So that's one of the downfalls I guess you could say, of having infrared focusing, that it just won't focus through glass, and that's where you'd get into a situation where you'd want to be setting your focus. You can set it to 999, which means infinity, or there are other settings that you can set it at as well. And some of the features reset themselves as soon as you take the pictures. Some features stay for the entire length of the roll of film unless you cancel them. So that's just the basics. And what I'm gonna do in the notes below, I'm gonna have 2 links that I think are the absolute minimum information you should have with this camera. And one of them is a link to the original instruction manual, and then one of them is a link to someone's addition to the user's manual, where he talks more specifically about these modes that you can access by combining pressing certain buttons. And that's what the follow-up videos are going to be about. We're going to follow through with some of those hidden features, like how do we get in the silent mode, how do we change the ASA of the film, how do we turn the focusing off. Well, the manual focusing does that, but in the silent shutter mode, and kind of demonstrate some of those as well. We'll also be talking about the flash, but unfortunately I lost the original Hexar 14 flash that came with this, but good news is you can set this to use with other small flashes. And why I say small is because the Hexar 14 had a guide number of 14 in the metric system, so you kind of want to get a flash that's around there. I'm not saying you can't use bigger flashes, but to go more with the style of what this camera could do, it's better to have that flash that's smaller. And just an outstanding camera. I did numerous weddings with this camera. I found this camera always to be able to focus quicker and better than I could, compared to using something like an SLR with manual focus. And it has a feature which is really good. I mean, this is the shutter button here, that you can press halfway down and it will focus. You can see it saying F13 is where it's going to set right now, but then you can move the camera. So if you're focusing on someone's face but they're on the edge of the field, you can focus for them, then turn the camera and take the exposure. Likewise, you can do that with the spot metering. You can press this halfway down and then change the framing and take the picture, and that's a very valuable thing to be able to do. So here we go. That's part 1, and please download the 2 references that I'm going to give you: the guide, the actual user's manual, and then the additions to the user manuals that this wonderful person put together in 1999.